Welcome to Full But Not Finished. I am your host, Stephanie Michelle, and this podcast is about food and body image, but also about the ongoing work of recovery and self development beyond food and body image. So, for those of you who are familiar with my work and have been following me for a while, thank you so much for being here. It means more than I can tell you that you're here, that you're following me on this piece of the journey. And for those of you who are new to me and to my work, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And I also wanted to give some background as to who I am and what this podcast is for and where it comes from. My name is Stephanie. I am in my mid 40s as of the time of this airing in 2025. I am 6 years plus into recovery from all sorts of EDs, but most specifically, and the one I identify with the most, is binge eating. For 25 years, I dealt with a binging cycle that varied between just binges and being stuck in day after day after day cycles of just not being able to at all feel even relatively regulated around food. Just felt completely bottomless for many, many years, as well as cycling through periods of high restriction and control, obsession with healthy eating, and other variations that I don't think I'm allowed to actually explicitly name here without risk of getting flagged on this platform. But I did recover. And in 2019, I went through an all in process that I chronicle in a different podcast that I hosted called Life After Diets, which you can check out. There's over 200 episodes of Life After Diets, a podcast that is very near and dear to me and very much representative of the beginning of my work in recovery and my life really in recovery as I navigated with my co-host Sarah, the ways in which we work through our relationship with food by working through our relationship with ourselves and vice versa. Sarah left that podcast and I have felt at a loss about how to continue. And so I do want to begin this podcast, this pilot episode, in a bit of a meta way by explaining that I am still here to talk about food and body image and our relationships with that. I still feel very passionately about helping others who are in that cycle. I don't know that I will ever stop feeling so passionately about helping people move through such sticky, messy, ugly, dark corners of life when we struggle with food and the shame of that and the solitude of that. But also the hope and the joy of working through these things and figuring out who we are outside of a culture that wants to define us and put us in certain boxes in a certain way. And I do really strongly believe in the cultural element of this and how reclaiming ourselves and recovery is a lot about rejecting the shoulds that come from social pressures and from systems at large that, you know, they're the macrocosm and the microcosm of that and the way we internalize shoulds. But I must admit that after I recovered in 2019 and started coaching and started posting on Instagram, I was finding my way. And it was like a springtime season of my life. It was like a rebirth. It was finally like the sun was coming out and I was really figuring out my flow and I was discovering new ways that I could feel empowered by podcasting and coaching. This was like, wow, I can finally become more than I thought that I could be. I'm discovering parts of myself that I didn't know were here. And for 4 or 5 years, that period of time in my life was just, it was magical. But most recently, in the past several months, is that things are starting to change. I notice even as I move further into my 40s that things are starting to change. I have about half the hair that I used to have. My body is changing. My moods are changing. My zest for talking about certain things is changing. And practically, the algorithms are changing. What was you? I used to talk on Instagram. That was my main hub. That was where I focused all of my energy and content. And it is a whole new world there. And I'm not finding my feet there anymore. And the podcast that I hosted with my co host, Sarah, for so many years came to an end when Sarah decided to pursue other ventures. And so, all at once, it felt like this crumbling of what I had built and what I had found refuge in following such a dark period of my life. I say a dark period, it was 25 years. I mean, it was like a significant period of my life. And 5 years later, things started to change and things started to change. And what was so interesting about that, and what remains so interesting to me about that, is that I had to kind of come up against this realization that I was finding myself in exactly the same position that I had found myself in 2019 when I had, just prior to actually entering my all-in process of recovery, when I was micromanaging my body size and I was chasing the old me that had been able to somehow get away with all of that restriction, or I had been by the skin of my teeth been able to sort of balance my weight goals with all of this binging that was happening behind the scenes. But then I would make up for it with all this compensation and restriction and control. And every day was like clawing at maintaining that balance because it was getting more and more and more elusive. And the things that had worked for me before were not working for me anymore. And the metabolism that I'd had before was not working for me anymore. And I was a mother of three, and I couldn't just collapse into bed for a weekend if I needed to not show myself, or if I felt really itchy in my own body, and if I binged even and just felt the discomfort of that. I didn't have the same resources and environments even that had allowed me to get to where I'd gotten just again by the skin of my teeth. And I remember just before I recovered, I remember thinking to myself, this word used to come into my head, and I used to always think unsustainable, unsustainable. And so when I would have these big binges, I would follow it up with these big periods of fasting. And I remember that every time I did that, there was something in me that registered, this is unsustainable. This isn't happiness to have like, whew, made up for it. It was like a ticking time bomb. And that level of pressure compressed me and compressed me and compressed me to such degrees that eventually I did radically enter this all-in process of recovery, because I just knew that I was burning the candle at both ends and I wasn't able to do it anymore. And the pressure system had become too high and the costs had become too high. What was interesting is that more recently I found myself re-identified with the listeners, of my podcast, and of, the people that followed me on Instagram and my clients, and like remembering really, really profoundly how difficult it is to change, to let something go that has served you and served you really well and protected you and just feels like safety. And over the past several months, I have been really grappling with the very same things that I grappled with in 2019, and that maybe you are grappling with as well, which is, I know that something needs to change, but I don't know how to leave the safety of what I know. I don't think I can do it. And I heard myself saying that, and I saw myself clinging to old patterns of like what I used to post and just trying that again. And again, continuing with my Life After Diets podcast, even though the nature of it had changed, and I just could feel that I was acting from fear and not from risk. And I don't begrudge that, by the way. There's a real method to that. I don't think we can just risk, like it's a process. But I find myself in this moment where I feel like if nothing changes, nothing will change. And this is exactly the place where I found myself 6.5 years ago, realizing that if I continue to repeat the same dieting pursuits, the same bargaining and negotiating with my ED, that I would continue to have one and that I wouldn't ever leave it. And it took me years, actually. I registered that long before I actually recovered, but it finally came to a head at a time where I had moved through the cycle so many times that I just at some point said, enough is enough. I need to make a change. And so I said to myself, Stephanie, you recovered and you learned from that. And this is the seed from which you talk about these things now. That moment of your life taught you everything that you know, that has strengthened you, that has built your resilience, that has shown you other ways of being safe. Use it. And so I decided to take some leaps and to let go of things that keep me safe, like my old podcast and the following I have there, starting from scratch, of having 0 followers here, of having potentially 0 listeners, and the risk of that when it comes to who will I be if I'm not who I have been, and how will I ensure that I'll be okay if I'm abandoning what I've built? It's not different from the exact feeling as I felt when I thought, who will I be if I'm not the healthy one? Who will I be if I'm not working at being smaller or fitter? Who will I be if I'm not able to run back into the arms of a disorder that keeps me safe and the coping mechanisms that maybe are destructive in the long run, but they sure as heck keep me feeling like I can survive in the here and now? And I know that listening to that quieter part of me, that more authentic, this is where I am and let's see what happens, feels here. And I'll take a moment just to take a bit of a breath, because when I slow down with that part of myself that feels safer, that feels like no matter what happens, whatever the turbulence is on the outside, that there's something on the inside that feels solid. That's something that I do want to slow down with, and I try not to bypass that too quickly. It's part of the somatic element of the work that I do, which I will bring into the podcast as well. But as I begin this podcast, which again will feature listener questions and answers. I love hearing from the people who listen to this podcast and hearing the questions that you have about your own work with food and body image and self, and the ways in which we navigate the culture that talks to us about that and the society we live in. I love hearing these questions. Please send in your questions. I will link below where you can submit them, and I use them as fodder for conversation within the podcasts themselves. But I also will talk about the practical elements of recovery and our relationship with food and all the things that I typically work around. But I also want to bring it towards how that folds into life and how this doesn't stop. This death and rebirth doesn't stop. Just because I recovered in 2019 and found this like heyday of time where it felt so great and I felt so free and I was like, yes, I've done it. I've made it. And here we are again in, I'm like, what's going to happen to me in menopause? Like, how is this all going to look? Is my body image going to come rearing back? Am I going to find myself in another grief spiral and despair pit of, mood catastrophic hormonal cataclysms? And I don't know. I just know that this process of death and rebirth, which I want to talk about in a moment, will continue to happen, and that recovery was just one of those things. It taught me a heck of a lot about how to cope with it and how to handle it, and I'm trying to use that now. But it won't stop. And that's partly what full but not finished means, is in addition to the practical element of that feeling we get when we have eaten enough, quote unquote, but we still have a longing, a yearning, a craving, a desire, a hunger for more. What that means, not just from a physiological viewpoint, but also from a psychological and emotional one, and a somatic one. But also how even when we reach fullness, it may in fact begin again. And there will be a time when we feel less and less full, and that this is the season, these are the seasons of life. And that, like the seasons outside our window, we move in the exact same way as we're part of the earth and nature and all of the processes around us. And this buzzkill of realizing that, I have to do it again. I have to do this again. I can't just get comfortable where I sit is a reality. And how do we keep evolving with every previous season of evolving and bringing it with us and helping it inform us? And is that really the point to this life, is to continue to evolve and to layer upon layer upon layer these challenges and these risks and these pain points, really, that we don't have a place we get to where we're full and we just stay full. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what rebirth means when it comes to actual recovery. If you are somebody who is struggling with, and when I refer to recovery, I am referring to our relationship with food, whatever that looks like for you, and body image and the struggles that we face in those areas. But there is a rebirth in this question, right? And I think that a lot about what recovery means is shedding something old to make room for something new. And I think that's an incredibly frightening ask. I also want to emphasize that rebirth doesn't mean a completely new version of yourself. And it's not asking you to turn everything you know on its head and go somewhere completely uncharted and become some different version of yourself, but rather to uncover parts of yourself. I think there's a part of it that's already inside. It's just kind of like when we work on moving away old stories or fears or layers of coping mechanisms that we needed deeply at one time, but they have become destructive as the season of our life has changed, that it's more about like what we're moving away, where those things are shedding to make more clear what is underneath rather than like a pursuit of something completely outside of us. So when we're talking about recovery, we're asking ourselves, how do I cope with my emotions without my symptoms? How do I face the raw activation in my body, the feeling of panic and despair and fear and doubt and like the stomach drop, like you're on a roller coaster of like, how am I gonna do this? That rush of fear and restlessness and the heaviness of grief. How do I face that in my body and be able to tolerate what my old coping skill was helping me manage? How do I be inside of myself? How do I learn how to deal with this? One way that this shows up a lot is with weight gain. So when we gain weight, whether that's incidentally or a product of aging or a byproduct of actual recovery when we're allowing ourselves to eat more foods, or our metabolism changes because the things that we were doing before aren't working anymore. Those moments where you notice that your body is changing. In a previous podcast episode, I explained the time that I reached forward to the faucet and I saw the curvature of my arm, the times where you put on your underwear and they're like a little snug and you can feel that tightness and that sensory pressure against your skin, or just when you sit, you buckle your seatbelt and you feel that you have to pull it. All these little symbols of we're gaining weight, right? What happens there? What happens is sensory, right? So we start to feel, we get the sensory input on our skin that we are in fact gaining weight, and from that point, the nervous system takes over. And a lot of times, what goes on there is it's what I always felt like as this rush of what maybe is adrenaline or stress hormone, or it's fear, it's the amygdala lighting up that's saying, oh no, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. But it is a feeling, it is a sensation, it is a panicking moment, whether that panic for you is large and loud and extreme, or it's quiet and subtle and itchy. How do we be the kind of person who can handle that? How do we hold that kind of activation in our body without rushing into the arms of the coping mechanisms? Because at that moment, the story that we're telling ourselves is that I can't cope with this. This is too overwhelming. I need something to get me out. And what gets us out are our symptoms. So sometimes restriction is the symptom that gets us out. It is whether that's physical or mental, right then and there, it can turn into controlling food. It can also turn into a plan to control food that probably starts Monday. It can also, ironically, be another binge. That sort of cruel irony of where something bothers us and then we move even more forcefully towards it, which seems like it doesn't make any sense, because why would we move towards the thing that we're actually trying to get away from? But there is a numbing in that. There is something about the short-term impact of hiding in something and fully sort of surrendering to the despair almost on purpose that is different than the long-term impact of that, which to our executive functioning is like, that doesn't make sense to do that. But that's only through logic. In the moment, using those symptoms is the quickest escape. It is a way of shutting out even the future in order to say, I can't survive the now. I need this now. Being the kind of person, quote unquote, who can tolerate what is happening in the body when we are talking about reacting to our weight gain or just our body in general, and awareness of the body in general. This could also be reacting to having eaten too much, fullness itself. I would say that most of our reactions are coming from a fear of weight gain. I think that's often the case. What that means in terms of our stories might be different, in terms of like, I am going to be threatened with being abandoned. I won't be lovable. I won't be able to be functional. I won't be able to walk as easily. My knees are going to hurt more. I won't be able to play with my grandkids as much. I will be less powerful. I will be seen as less desirable. I will not feel safe. I will have to be in my body instead of feeling like I don't have a body. There's so many different ways that we fear weight gain and that different types of people in different life experiences have come to fear weight gain. How do we become somebody who can tolerate that, right? In that is recovering, right? There is something about recovering that is about tolerance and even acceptance, which can feel like a bad word in many ways. It can feel like a surrender in terms of a negative thing, like a disempowerment. I would argue that, and we can talk about that at a different time. But there's a humility in it. There's something that feels like a humility in it. That is the death of control and of the version of us that had control enough to even just to escape, and moving into something much more vulnerable and unknown and uncertain. That act right there, whether you're talking about body weight and food recovery or anything else, starting a new podcast, entering menopause, entering motherhood, committing to a relationship, ending a relationship, starting a new job, ending an old job. These stops and starts in life will continue to come. And all of them involve saying goodbye to something that at one time helped us and going towards something we're not sure is going to help us, or we don't have any guarantees. That middle place of I don't know is intolerable for many of us. And it's the absence of a secure sense of safety. Whereas old symptoms or old things, old stories, while again, potentially destructive, at least they're familiar. At least we know there's some relief in them, at least some of the time. And without the potential for relief, it can feel like you're upstream without a paddle. There is risk involved in recovery. There is loss involved in recovery. And there is uncertainty and vulnerability involved in recovery. The truth is as well that there is growth and evolution and reward that comes from risk. And when you risk, you do not have to abandon fear. You can bring it with you. I don't know any other way. Like any risk I've ever taken, the most potent of which was my recovery process and entering into a year-long, I'm going to probably gain weight. I don't know how much. I don't know if I'll ever stop eating. Was a huge risk accompanied by a large amount of fear. But there was something in here, in the center of me, that understood that if I didn't take that risk, despite the fear sitting there the whole time, that I would stay exactly where I was. And I knew at that point that that risk was bigger. To stay where I was to risk something bigger. And so if you are in a season of change, which I imagine is why you listen to a podcast like this, and maybe that change, that season of change is actually very much about recovering and leaving, trying to move away from symptoms that no longer serve you towards a different way of being and tolerating. Or maybe it's about something else, because a lot of times these things, again, this is life as it is. So the first exercise or the practice that you can try, and this is probably the most 101, is to actually just journal or bullet note risks you have taken in your life. Where have there been places, maybe they're smaller spaces of risk, where you took a leap, maybe because you chose to, but maybe because you were forced to? Where has risk existed in your life and where has it gotten you? You might find that risks haven't panned out very well, and maybe that's part of what contributes to having fear around risks. Maybe you've taken risks or been forced even into positions of risk or loss that have initially been extremely difficult, but brought you to places that you had no idea that they might go. And I would encourage you to think about things big and small here, but just to kind of get a lay of the land around where have I already been through this, and what has that done for me? How have I survived? The second thing to look at is the time horizon of this. So instead of thinking about a risk as a permanent, forever, for the rest of my life, everything has to change kind of idea, to give a limit on it. What if I took a risk for a period of time? what if for the next month I tried this? This was the risk. For those of you familiar with my backstory, when I did go into recovery, I actually part of the way that I negotiated my way into it was to tell myself that I only had to try it for a year and that I only, if at the end of the year I didn't like allowing more foods and that I couldn't really figure it out or my weight gain was too unbearable for me, that I could go back. And so giving myself this timeline, which for me, again, that year felt for me enough time that I wasn't racing against a clock and feeling like my time was running out, but it also gave me enough time that I was like, if in a year's time I'm just where I am, in a worse place, I'll start again. I'll just wipe that slate clean and pretend that year never happened. Um, so even just to give yourself time periods of what if I can sort of control the time frame of this and I can see what it's like to take certain risks. That might also look like, by the way, taking breaks from exercise. It might look like eating more meals in a day if you're somebody who fasts. I've worked with a lot of clients who have fasting rituals are really hard to break. And so a lot of times we'll say, well, what if we just try this for a month or even a week? And then you can go right back to what you were doing, or having bigger meals, or working with rest, or saying no more often, or having less commitments, or having more commitments, depending on what side of the spectrum that you find yourself on. Challenging yourself to do the thing that is the risk, but for a finite amount of time. The third practice is more somatic, and this comes from actually confronting the risk. So let's say that you offer yourself an invitation to not exercise to compensate for a period of time, or to maybe initiate a movement practice in places where you feel like you have a strong rebellion against it, let's just say. And let's say that as you're experimenting with this, you run right up to the place where you're trying to avoid, which is either your rebel spirit being like, I feel like you're making me exercise and I don't want to exercise and don't you tell me I have to, or it might be its opposite of, which is fear, and it says, I'm sitting here in my discomfort of fullness and I can't exercise and I don't know that I can tolerate it. In both of these cases, we're talking about we're running up against a confrontation of what we can tolerate. So whether we're trying to tolerate a rebel spirit or we're trying to tolerate a fear, that is in your body. So to find where that lives in your body, whether the rebel is getting adrenaline pumped and the chest is getting, the heart's beating fast and the face is flushing, or we're starting to feel boxed in or claustrophobic and we actually feel like there's a part of us that wants to like break out, just like act and move. Or the fear is coming in and we feel like there's something in our stomach that's starting to churn, or there's like an emptiness that's clawing its way through the chest. I felt both of these things obviously before. I have really like pretty concrete descriptors for how they feel in my own body. But to focus on that as the sensation to tolerate, to say like, okay, I'm noticing that this right here is what is so difficult for me. This right here is what I'm afraid of. This is why I don't risk. It's right here. It's living in me right now. Can I spend a moment with it? Can I place my hands on my chest and feel that heart racing? Can I feel that fear through my stomach and hold on? There are other ways of working with this to actually move the body. There's ways of working with this to soothe the body. But the beginning comes from meeting the thing we're afraid of, holding it in our body with intention and with compassion and patience. And then you can give yourself permission to do whatever comes after that. You don't have to force yourself into a place, but at least we've practiced the art of meeting what we're afraid of and seeing how it actually feels to be with that for longer. Because so much of why we hold on to symptoms has to do with fearing that very thing. And if we don't practice meeting that very thing, we won't ever learn the embodied sense of feeling like that thing might end up being safe or that we can tolerate it. And then we're reinforcing the story of the version of us that can't tolerate it. So there is part of like rebirth that involves trying new things, even if you can only try them for a little bit of time. But until we try those new things, we will consistently be identifying with the part of us that doesn't know how or can't. The fourth activity is another journaling one, if you're into that, which is called a small deaths exercise. And it's kind of like writing a eulogy for the coping skill that you're starting to recognize is unsustainable, right? It's costing you too much. Maybe it's an identity itself. Maybe it's a behavior in its entirety, or maybe it's a symptom. So maybe writing something about what this symptom gave you. In what ways was it life-saving to you? In what ways do you have a lot of gratitude for how it's been able to help protect you for so long? And what you're thinking about letting go of, how you're thinking about letting go of that, how you're thinking about allowing that symptom to have played its role in your life, at least for the time being, and that you might want to try other things. So to give it sort of its due credit, and to, instead of to give it a character assassination, as we tend to do with our symptoms with food, we tend to think of them as the enemy. I find it much more productive to think about them as companions that have helped us get here. And that now we're trying to let something go and to thank it for its service, and to say, I'm moving to try some new things now. Thank you so much for how you've helped me. That can be quite a symbolic way of making something feel like it has permission to close. And it doesn't mean that from the moment you write that letter, or that eulogy, that from then on you'll be good to go, and that should just seal the deal in your brain. There may be times where we go back and forth, but at least it's the beginning. I think it's kind of almost like the beginning of a grief process. And as long as we're initiating that process, there might be things that work over time to continue that grief process, even outside of that letter writing. And then the final thing is a witness practice. So telling someone that you trust, somebody safe, what you are trying to do, what you are trying to leave behind, and what you are trying to step into. So sometimes I actually have clients who contact me initially because they're at this point and they're saying, I've been listening for years, or I've been following, accounts like yours or your account for years. And I've been doing as much as I can in the fear and contemplation stage, and I now need help. They don't say it this way, but I think about it as, I need a witness. I need somebody to speak this aloud to. I've had so many clients where after even just the discovery call, there is this burden has been lifted from them because they've named this to somebody else, and they've said, like, this is what I am actually coming to coaching for, and I need help. Once we offer that to someone else and somebody else sees it for us, it also feels like a permission to start addressing something with more intention. So whether that's by finding support through therapy, through coaching, but also potentially just talking to a friend or a partner or, somebody that we trust around, this is something that I'm actively working towards. Sometimes just naming it into existence and having it be witnessed makes it feel more real. So that is another way that you can take another small step towards letting something go and moving towards something new. And none of these things require drastic shifts. They're not lifelong commitments. They're just taking a step towards something new in ways that when they're stuck in our own brains, or when we're kind of avoiding them or trying to make them not true and pushing them down, those things can't come to life. So think of it as a step one. In my own way, recording this podcast, which I nearly didn't do today because there was a part of me thinking, let's just not do this. You are my witness to saying, I don't exactly know what this is, who I am here, but come along with me. I promise to show up as authentically as I can and to arrive in the next version of myself out loud. I will be back next week to talk about food and body image, and also to answer some listener questions. If you have questions of your own that you would like me to use as inspiration for a topic, please email me with the links below and I will put them on my master list. And I appreciate those of you who just are here to listen. Please feel free to put comments below. They help me so much and they just make me feel more connected to this community of people. I hope that you all have a great day, and I will see you again next week.